Okay, so I have upgraded my stuff, and now I can put music through. So we'll see how long this goes. Today, I want to show you a new scale. This is part of this series on symmetrical scales, and the one I want to show you today goes like this. And it's called the whole tone scale. So named because it is built off of all whole steps. As a review from last week, we were talking about the diminished scale, and that is a scale built off of a series of half steps and whole steps. And there's two ways to do it. You can either do half step, whole step, half step, whole step as a repeating pattern. So if I'm playing in C, and I'm on, as you can see, an alto today, I'll still play in C. That's okay. If I started in half step, whole step, what sounds like is this. You can also play it the other way, and that is if you go whole step, half step, whole step, half step. It's kind of like the second variation of the diminished scale, I guess. And based upon that, you actually have, from any given starting note, the option of playing 8 diminished scales. So, as a quick review, remember that each diminished scale is built in 4 keys, and the process that we've come up by doing that is you take the notes from 4 major scales built in minor thirds, and once you subtract all the common notes, you end up with something called the diminished scale, which is a symmetrical set of 8 notes that's built in half steps and whole steps. For those of you who are trying to understand this video but not watch the first one, it might be kind of tough. So if that just blew over the top of your head, you might want to go check the other video out in which I talk about how the diminished scale is built in more detail with how the scales fit inside the diminished scale. As a quick tip, or I guess disclaimer, I will not be talking about how to use these necessarily right now because that would take too long. So this is kind of just an introduction in how to think about using this system and the construction of the scales, and then we can talk about like how to use them if I decide to keep making videos. So we'll continue on with the whole tone scale, and again, it's a scale built in whole steps. So it's kind of like the diminished scale. It just removes the half step part, I guess. But it is a scale built in all whole steps. And the reason I wanted to pick this scale is because, like I said at some point in the last video, there's like 4 symmetrical scales, and they have to do with the division of the 12 keys of your full chromatic set of notes, right? Remember that if you divide 12 by its divisible components, 4 and 3, 3 and 4, 2 and 6, 6 and 2, 1 and 12, 12 and 1, each of those sets of divisibles actually has its own symmetrical scale. So the first one we covered was the diminished scale, and that would be 3 scales, and each scale contains 4. Okay, I had to cut that because I just actually said a bunch of wrong stuff. So whole tone scale is kind of weird, man. Okay, well, the first part that I said was true. Diminished scales, I checked this in my paperwork because I had to go back to my staff notebook and verify this. But the diminished scale is actually, you can go through the scales, I guess in the case of the diminished scale, add together C major, E flat major, F sharp major, and A major. See, I'm not thinking again. Okay, take 3 of that diminished scale, because, well, the other thing that I forgot too, which hopefully you didn't memorize it from the last video, I said scales, add the scales. In the diminished scale system, you have to add the triads together, not the scales. Add the triads together, not the scales. So if you add a C major triad, an E flat major triad, nice. That's going to be cool for this video. An F sharp major triad and an A major triad, okay? And you subtract the common notes in that, what ends up happening is you do actually end up getting the diminished scale. So that works. Oh man, this has gone off the rails. So go back to the whole tone scale. It's a funny scale because I actually just retook apart the scale because I realized that there's a problem with the way I was thinking about it. And you and the internet are the first to know, I suppose. But the whole tone scale is weird because if you do that same triadic process and take away all those subtracted notes, the repeated notes, so C major, D major, E major, F sharp major, G sharp major, B flat major, you end up getting the full chromatic scale. So the whole tone scale kind of, I still have to do more research on this, but the whole tone scale doesn't operate by the exact same rules as the diminished scale. But the key centering thing still applies, okay? So let's just go back to the whole tone scale, and I'll play that, like, we'll just start from the beginning a little bit here. Okay? So, one property of that scale is that it's actually built in this thing called a augmented triad. An augmented triad is in relation to a major key, 1, 3, sharp 5. 1, 3, sharp 5. So if you're in C, it's C, E, and G sharp. The thing about an augmented triad, and this is the part that I am actually quite sure of, is that it's built in a symmetrical interval of major thirds. So if you go up a major third from C, okay, it's E. If you go up a major third from E, it's G sharp. If you go up a major third from G sharp, it goes back up to C. So the augmented triad itself is actually a symmetrical triad. Okay? It just keeps going on forever because it'll just keep flipping on its own head. Now, this augmented scale, this whole tone scale, not augmented scale, that's for later. Goodness gracious. This whole tone scale is built off of two augmented triads. If you add a C augmented triad and a D augmented triad, what you'll end up getting is a scale that is built in all whole steps. And, okay, let's go back kind of a few steps again. The reason that this fits in 6 keys is because if you play a C augmented triad, a D augmented triad, those are different notes. But remember what I said about augmented chords? They're all built in major thirds. So a C augmented triad is actually the same as an E augmented triad, which is actually the same as a G sharp augmented triad. That's kind of the same as we go back to diminished scales, how they're built in minor thirds. C diminished chord is the same as E flat diminished chord, and so forth. And you can build the diminished scale. It just keeps flipping on its head. The augmented triad works in the same way. That's kind of why I wanted to do this whole tone scale after the diminished scale, because it kind of relates a little bit like that. That third is the same no matter what you do in the respective scales. In diminished scales, it all has to do with minor thirds. In this whole tone scale, it has to do with major thirds. Okay? So technically speaking, you could play the whole tone scale ascending in thirds, like you would like any regular major scale, like for example this, except you would stack them in major thirds instead of in your major scale, obviously. Okay, so if you take your diminished, or not diminished, goodness gracious, if you take the whole tone scale and play it in thirds, what ends up happening is this. Those are all exactly the same symmetrical third. So in the same way, that scale keeps flipping itself on its head as well. It's even more symmetrical to the diminished scale because instead of using 2 intervals, it actually only uses 1 repeating interval. In kind of a weird way, the whole tone scale is like the chromatic scale, because the chromatic scale, if you go half step, half step, half step, half step, you end up getting all 12 notes, obviously. Well, if you go whole step, whole step, whole step, whole step, what happens? You have to cut out half those notes. So what you end up getting is the remaining 6 notes, and they are actually built in parallel or symmetrical whole steps. Hence the whole tone scale. Now, that scale resets itself at the whole step. So it only takes you 1 whole step to get up to the next key. And then again, you're back in regular territory. So that's why it encompasses 6 keys, so to speak, because if you play C whole tone scale, you can go up a step to D. If you play D whole tone scale, isn't that just C whole tone scale starting on D? And you can actually keep going if you go up another whole step to E whole tone scale. Isn't that just C whole tone scale starting on E, or D whole tone starting on E? And you can see where this logic follows. No matter where you start in that scale, because you're using the same exact interval, they're all the same scale, just starting on a different starting note. So it's a big cycle. That cycle includes 6 keys. Okay, how do you get to the other scale? Well, you got to flip it up a half step, obviously, because that's the only interval that's left. And now you get the other whole tone scale, which encompasses the other 6 keys of the chromatic. Okay, so with those 2 whole tone scales, you've now covered all 12 keys. Each whole tone scale only covers 6 keys, essentially, because of the way that the notes are spaced out in the chromatic. Okay? Oh, so we're not probably going to cover how to use them. Not yet. But stick around for the next video, because we got more of these weirdo scales to cover. In fact, now that I have this newfangled device, I can show you what our new scale is going to be. It sounds like this.